Great. Hi. So hello, welcome to the third of this year's webinar Wednesdays for dance professionals, brought to you by The Place. My name is Jay Neve Harrington, and my role is artist associate at The Place, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman in my 30s. I've got a grey hoodie on and sort of chin length brown hair and some gold hoop earrings. I'm delighted to be joined today by Asad Raza, who is going to lead a session on making your own soil and drinking water at home, interdisciplinary collaborations with people and place. So in a moment, Asad is going to unpack what that means for his practice and introduce himself. But before that, just a little bit of housekeeping. So for anyone who might need them, there are captions available. Those are in English. If you would find that useful, you can click on the bottom of your screen. Depending on your settings, it might also be worth checking the top of your screen, but those should appear. Great, see that's already happening. You may have noticed that we're joined today by two BSL interpreters. We have Lauren and Caroline. They will be with us throughout the session today, and they'll be changing over about every 15 minutes. And you should be able to see them on your screen. You're welcome to pin them if that is useful for you. If you have any questions or technical problems, you can just drop a message in the chat. We've got Poly Day in the background. Any issues with captions or BSL, you can let us know and we will help you. In Asad's session today, we're really welcoming maybe a less formal approach. So questions, as Asad will tell you in a moment, in friendly interruptions are welcome. So you can always drop things into the chat and we'll respond to those. At the end, we're going to make time for a bit of a longer question or conversation session. And there's different ways that you can do that. So you can either sign those if you're a BSL user, or if you'd like to, you can speak your question, you can raise your hand, or you can use the chat function. And Polly and I will be checking those as we go along and accumulating questions at the end. So don't be shy. All right, so that's the housekeeping bit over with. We've got until 3 p.m. So hi, Asad, it's really great to have you here. Would you like to do a brief introduction, pronouns, audio description, and then we get into it?
Absolutely. And thank you, Neve, for inviting me to be part of the webinar series. And I know a couple of the people I saw on the participant list, so it's nice to see them too. Yeah, so my pronouns are he slash uh, and I am a Pakistani American male in my late 40s, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt, and I'm in front of a light green wall. So, yeah, I was interested in this invitation, and I'm not 100% sure how people working primarily in choreography will engage with these presentation, but I think it's relevant even across visual art, where I do most of my projects. Most of my projects happen in museums and art galleries. But I was realizing something about my practice when Neve invited me to do this webinar, which relates to working with outside collaborators, by which I mean collaborators from outside the field in which I'm presenting a project. So, for instance, on many projects, I collaborated with other artists, curators, art historians, choreographers, etc. But I'm talking now a little bit more about people from beyond that. So I thought I would start by showing a few images from some projects I've been working on. And I also realized that I basically started making my own work, as opposed to, I used to be primarily a producer working for other artists. And I started making my own work and my own films more publicly 10 years ago. So it's kind of nice to do this now, 10 years later. I met Neve like 13 years ago, I think, when Neve was doing a piece, choreographing a piece on the Millennium Bridge between Tate Modern and St. Paul's in London. But anyway, that's another story. So to start with the project from 10 years ago, now I'm going to have to present, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. I hope this will work. Can you see that? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Thank you, Tom Hastings. So I 10 years ago, I did a show in my own small one-bedroom apartment in New York. And I had the idea of inviting people to do something, not necessarily not necessarily just to put art inside my apartment, but to do something to my life, because I was interested in how like making art and being part of art, the art field, can somehow help you to transform yourself. And so I had asked about 35 different people, and some of them were pretty well-known visual artists. Others were family members and friends, and each of them came up with a practice of some kind, which they put, which I would do, or they would somehow cite in my apartment. And then for 5 weeks, I gave people tours of this every day from noon until 6 p.m. So for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for like 5 weeks, which turned out to be extremely tiring, but also a lot of fun. And in the image you're seeing right now, for instance, there are some more traditional works. Like you can see a painting of the lunar phases by Sarah Morris. And you can also see a remainder piece by Jessica Dickinson. Beautiful pieces where she does charcoal rubbings on her own paintings and creates these kind of shadow pieces. But there's also in the image pieces that are far more, let's say, active in terms of the relationship to me living there. So on the small little, almost like a little hook and hanger that you can see on the bedside table, there's a bunch of green grapes hanging. And this was a piece done by Nick Mouse for that show, where he asked me to eat grapes whenever I was like awake but in bed. And then he gave me this kind of sculpture to hang these grapes on by the bed, which was a weird thing to do, but I did it. And it was kind of fun. And then the bed is actually a bedspread that I'd had since childhood, and a pillow that my older sister made me when I was like 4 years old. And these were things that were never really out in the apartment, but an artist who contributed to this project, Rachel Rose, she decided to edit all of my possessions and kind of rearrange my things. And so she threw out like 5 bags of things that I owned in consultation with me. So I didn't totally just let her throw things away that I, had a real important sentimental relationship to or something. And then she also kind of arranged everything very particularly. And she brought this blanket and this pillow out and put them out on the bed so that people would somehow see that. For her, what was interesting, so that it would tell you something, told something about me, I guess, in her opinion. So that was another piece which I found very interesting, because it was like she didn't introduce any new objects into my space, but she completely changed the place. And I thought that that was a very interesting thing. She functioned kind of like a great film editor, but for my actual stuff. So whoops. Oh, I see, when I click, it does a kind of fade out and fade in. So this is something that a friend, Adrian Villarojas, did in my freezer, where we bought all of these seafood and vegetables and beer in Chinatown, which is where my apartment is. And he created this kind of Dutch still life in the freezer with it, except for instead of being a painting representing those elements that are in the still life, it was actually those elements, but frozen. So you could only look at it briefly, because every time you opened it, it started to, you didn't want this all to start to melt or to thaw and go bad. So it was an interest, again, like an interesting relationship to the site I found from this project, and also to the idea of something can, to, how something can be preserved or maybe cannot be preserved. Anyhow, so I guess I wanted to start with this project, and these are some items from my own life that were arranged by Rachel and I on the shelf. And I realized from I guess when I was looking back thinking about this project, how did I get started with doing a lot of collaborative work? I think it started with this project because I had this idea, like, I live in this apartment and people who know me maybe can do something to how I live. Like, it was always for me about creating an impact on everyday life rather than creating something like more formal. And Neve already, I think you alluded to this when you said that my presentation would be kind of informal, which probably is true. By the way, now that I'm presenting, I can no longer see the chat or anything. So if someone has a question or wants to stop me, just say, or Neve, you can tell me. So anyhow, starting with that project, I began to do projects in museums and galleries. And one of the earlier ones was this project from the Whitney Biennial in New York in 2017. And in that project, I was thinking a lot back then about the idea of, like, caring for one another as something that was important to kind of highlight, and something that had a long history in the arts, which goes back, even, you could, there's a lot of famous artworks, Michelangelo's Pietà, for instance, which are all about the kind of pathos between individuals, or the pathos between beings. And I was thinking at that time about how can you display this in a contemporary way in the museum? And I was thinking that maybe we could grow something like an actual living thing in the museum. Now, animals are kind of out of the question, because I don't know if it's 100% ethically okay to keep an animal in an exhibition. I'm just not, it might be, but I'm not sure about that. So then we had the idea that, what if we took young trees, like 3-year-old and 4-year-old trees, and we tried to help, keep them going, basically, as best as we could inside the museum. And then when the show was over, plant those trees in a kind of grove permanently. But while they were in the museum, the people who took care of the trees, who I called caretakers, for basically obvious reasons, they would actually be able to interact with you, and they would talk to you about the trees. And then I also took objects that belonged to them and placed them in and amongst the trees, and they could also explain things about those objects to you. Actually, in this image, you're seeing one of the caretakers from that piece, Nikima Yagudayev, who's now a choreographer and artist in her own right. And you can also see on one of the other sort of wooden boxes, a diary that belonged to Nikima that she placed in with these trees. And also you'll see like a Native American style beaded purse in another one that belonged to one of the other caretakers, Natalie Ball, who's also become a pretty well-known artist in their own right. So anyway, memories. But I think what was interesting for me about this project in relation to this idea of collaboration with people from outside is, this was one of the first times that I started to collaborate with people from, not just curators or other artists, but like, I really needed to work with horticulturalists and ecologists and figure out which trees would be okay for this grow zone and could share space together, and what they would need inside the museum, because part of the piece was about trying to show how the museum how much work you have to do to make the museum into a hospitable place for a living thing. And that what does that say about the museum as a space? Maybe it was part of my idea, but I found that portion of it, collaborating with horticulturalists from the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens and ecologists, really interesting, and I learned a lot from them. And I just started to get to kind of gravitate towards working with people on subjects which I didn't know at all. Actually, here you can see one of the gardens that resulted. This is one of the permanent gardens that resulted from that piece. This one is in Long Island in New York. And anyhow, moving forwards, oh my God, it's already 3:20. We're going so slow. In 2019, I got asked to make a public artwork in Sydney, Australia, by a guy called John Caldor. And he had been doing public art projects with artists for like 50 years in Australia. So he's in his 80s. And he brought me to Australia, and I spent a little bit of time there thinking about what I could do. And something I noticed there was that a lot of conversations I had in Australia were about the land. And they tended to be either about like the health of the land and the environmental issues relating to the land, or they tended to be about the kind of cultural ownership of the land and who the land belonged to and who needs to be taken into account in order to think about who the land belongs to. And I just found that all very, very interesting, because those two conversations didn't seem to come together. One about the health of the land, and the other about the kind of cultural ownership of the land. And so I had this strange idea that like we could try to make land, or at least make the constituent element of land, which in my idea was that like we could make soil. And so I was talking about this with John Caldor, and he said, that's an interesting idea, but you don't know what you're really talking about because you don't know enough about soil. So why don't we try to meet a soil scientist? And that was actually the beginning of a very interesting process, because through collaborating with soil scientists, the first one was the director of the soil science department at the University of Sydney. His name is Alex McBratney. I learned an amazing amount about soil from basically knowing nothing, but just seeing an image of us creating this soil and then trying to give it to people. And my idea was that we could fill a museum with this, and then when visitors would come, they would actually be able to walk on it and smell it and interact with it, see it being made, see the ingredients being mixed together. My idea was that we could gather the ingredients from the city in Sydney and then give it away. The people could take it. So that's what we did. But of course, it could never have happened without Alex and these other soil scientists. I ended up working with a number of them from his department and grad students. And yet, one of the things that I think, and this is relevant to this webinar, is that they had a very scientific understanding of what a fertile soil is and what makes soil, healthy. And that was very important to know so that we could try to create a fertile soil out of basically waste materials. But what I found really interesting was trying to get them to simplify what they were telling me, and trying to make the recipe simpler and simpler to the point where we could almost be something you could teach anybody to do. And basically at the end, we realized that, as long as you have, like, the simplest recipe for a very rich soil is essentially a third sand, a third clay, and a third organic material. And then if you keep it wet not wet, sorry, if you keep it moist but not, wet, and you keep it from getting very dry and dusty, and you make sure that it has a kind of aerated, porous quality, which comes from being generally that comes from being not disturbed too much in the natural world, but it can also be created by introducing earthworms or other kinds of small insects and animals. Then you're pretty much good to go. And that was a moment for me, an important moment, because I realized, like, oh, this is something that you can actually tell people, and then they can do this basically at home if they need to. Because the old idea was soil is something that you dig up and it's already in the world and it's created by natural processes over thousands of years. But unfortunately, most people don't live in a place where there's like usable soil, because it's either been removed, paved over, or contaminated, usually with heavy metals. And so I was thinking to myself, it's kind of interesting to produce a recipe for something that used to be easy to find, or relatively easy to find, and isn't anymore. And so that project, which we did in Sydney, which I called absorption, because it was about absorbing all of these waste materials and producing, in that case, like 300 tons of this artificial soil. We ended up doing the project in a lot of different cities: Berlin, Essen, Glasgow. But I also started doing things with that recipe. So we started making posters with that recipe. We started doing workshops with that. I did a video where I show how you can make soil in your own kitchen. And so, like, at some point, it almost became like it just was something that grew out of the project. And you could say, like, is this visual art anymore? Like, what is this that we're doing now? I'm just promulgating this soil recipe and trying to teach people about it. Like, have I become an ecologist? But I don't really know as much as an ecologist. So it was all about a function I think art can play, which is very important, which is to bring simplicity and to connect different disciplines, right? And I think that art and the arts can do that in a way, be a place where people can kind of learn about their world in a way that's not so highly disciplinary and not so specific and so hard to understand for people outside of a given field. Like, if you go and talk to Alex McBratney and Stephen Cattle, two soil scientists talking to each other, it's really hard to understand what they're talking about, because they're talking about issue that there's so much jargon and there's so much special knowledge. But if you find from their work a way to produce something that can be done in a museum, or in my case, in museums, but really anywhere in your own kitchen, and then you put that knowledge, you kind of spread that knowledge more widely, I think people become that gives people a chance to engage and to kind of become almost like an author of them, or become the active person themselves. And so in the case of this show, when we finally did the show in Sydney, and when we opened the show in Sydney in 2019, Alex McBratney actually came, and when he saw what I had done, he was like really surprised. I think he was in some ways at first kind of horrified, because he felt like we hadn't really done anything in terms of showing all of the science. And he told me, he was like, I thought there were going to be charts, and there were going to be soil cores, and there were going to be displays about the world's soil types, and instead it's just like the whole place is full of this stuff, which is cool. But then, as you know, we were standing there, a group of people came in who had kids, and the kids just like ran in and started playing with the soil, and they were like somehow delighted by this space of like the kind of sensory space, play space for them. And so I felt like there's something about creating those kind of experiences that is actually pretty important also, in addition to just creating more and more highly specialized and highly specific knowledge. And so yeah, you can experiment with that recipe and create different soil types at home using all kinds of different stuff. And I recently did some with a group of kids in Berlin at a kids arts program, and we used hair that we cut from ourselves. We used sand and clay, and we used lentils, and we used all these different things. And then we planted like dry lentils in there because they fix nitrogen into the soil. And like within a week, wait, I need to do this. Within a week, I got a picture from their school, which I'm showing you now, which is like these lentils just went nuts in there. And they were really thought that was cool, that we could mix together a medium ourselves that would like really work for plants to grow. And of course, once you take these lentils out, that soil will even be further enriched with nitrogen, because that's what happens with legumes. Sorry, I'm getting a little technical now. Okay, so it's 3:30. I have 10 more minutes. I want to switch over to a different project. I'll show you a couple more images of that project first, though. These are the people who are cultivating the soil, and we're mixing new ingredients into it. These are dried cuttlefish, which we were using and grinding up and putting into the soil. It's a very plentiful ingredient in Sydney. They're just all over the place. This is the bathroom, which I included all the rooms in this place called Carriage Works in Sydney, because I didn't want you to feel there was an easy way to escape from like engaging with this, what I call neosoil. Then these are some of the people in Berlin, the cultivators working on, we always keep a notebook and keep notes of what's being mixed in, and we test the pH and the salinity, and we keep notes on that. And then this is from through the glass doors from the atrium, you can see the depth of it. It's about 30 centimeters deep. I think you get the picture. So this idea can kind of work at the level of a large exhibition, but it can also just be something you can do at home in your kitchen. I'm interested in that kind of a crossover. So I want to move on to a different project now, which I don't have that many great images of, but anyway, we will try to talk about it. In 2022, I was invited to do a project in a place, sorry, that's not something else, in a place called Porticus, which is a gallery in Frankfurt. And it turned out that I went to visit, and it was a beautiful museum slash art, Kunsthalle is what it really is, an art hall. But it's on a small uninhabited island right in the middle of Frankfurt. It would be like in London if there was a tiny island, in between like Blackfriars and London Bridge, and that there was a small museum on there. And I was really intrigued by that. And I had this thought, that it was the perfect place for this project I'd wanted to do, or an idea I'd wanted to do, which was called diversion, which was essentially about diverting a river through a museum or a gallery. And so we end up working with engineers and hydrologists, and coming up with a system of tubes and pipes that basically allowed us to take water from the river, pump it up to the windows of Porticus, and then down these pipes, and then we created a channel where people could walk in the water or engage with the water and touch the water. And that was really important to me when I first talked to the curators about it, that people had to be able to walk in the water, because otherwise it would become just a visual, kind of cool visual feature, like a little water feature, but I want it to be somehow more than that. But of course, no one would go in the water unless you really knew you could. And so we had a group of people who I called the custodians, who were able to, who were working at all times there. and they would help you actually take, they would tell you that you could go in the water and take your shoes off and walk in the water. And again, for me, I think it's a lot about how do these outside elements in the world come through? How can we bring those things into and through the the exhibition space or the performance hall or these formal spaces that we have? So to have the river kind of flowing through and then going back out the other side and back into the river was sort of incorporating this into this circuit of energy or circuit of the global water cycle. And again, working with engineers and hydrologists was very important, but it wasn't so important to display the complexity of what we were doing. And then I'd had this idea, which I worked on with a hydrologist actually from the University of Birmingham, which was I wanted to clean jugs of water from this channel, because this channel was coming straight out of the Main River in the middle of Frankfurt, which, just like the Thames or the Hudson, you would not necessarily drink a glass of this water normally. But I thought that that was something kind of crucial, that you could drink the water of the river. And so this hydrologist and I talked to him, and we discussed different machines that you could use, and like ozone, you can like shoot it with ozone, or you can do this, you can do that, you can put chlorine in it, you can, there's all kinds of ways that you could purify this water. And at some point I thought to myself, thought back to the soil and to the idea of doing something in your own kitchen. And I said, well, what if we had to clean a jug of this water in your kitchen? Like, could you do it if, and then I was just thinking, like, what tools I have around? Well, everybody has a kettle. Everyone has usually like some kind of filters for coffee or tea. So I said, if you pass it through a coffee filter and boiled it, would it be clean? And Kieran, the hydrologist, said, actually, it would be cleaner than tap water if you did that. So that became like our method. And we ended up making this little station in the lower gallery where we had just those things. We had a kettle, we had a coffee filter. It was kind of a fancy one because that's what I found at this cool coffee place near Porticus. It was a Chemex coffee filter. And we had a little jug where we would pour the filtered water. And I put some stones in there, which were like mineral stones, hoping to kind of, remineralize the water from there. And then on the left side of this table, you can see these bamboo, kind of like what they are is like, they're to dip into a water to taste, you can drink water from those, so people could drink the water. And it turned out to be a really emotional part of this project that I never anticipated, but people became especially people who were from Frankfurt, they would drink the water and they would just be like kind of emotional because they'd never tasted the water from the river that they crossed every day several times, like didn't, I was pretty surprised by that. But I also kind of like that it was very much out in the open how we were doing it. And it was just this very simplistic equipment on a table. The water never disappeared into a kind of high-tech black box and then came out purified. So in that sense, like, even though there was a lot of technology involved in this whole operation of pumping, diverting the stream of the river, pumping it up into the gallery and then through the gallery and back to the river, like that wasn't really what was your attention was being drawn to. And so again, like, you can do this at home. You can take a jug of water from your local flowing water source, pass it through a coffee filter, boil it, pour it into a container, maybe put it in the fridge if you like cold water, like me. If you like it room temperature, you just don't even have to do that. And it's done. Like, you have drinkable water. And again, like, I guess that kind of crosses beyond what you're sort of visual, what would be normally thought of as a visual art move or something, to clean and filter the water that you drink. But I also feel like that's something that people allows you to engage with your world, to have that knowledge, and to actually taste the water in the gallery, and of course, I do know some people who told me, like, yeah, I was too scared to actually taste the water. And the first time we did this process and I tried the water, I was also pretty scared, but it was fine. And we drank the water for 3 months of the show, and it was okay. So again, like, I guess I've developed this practice where I think it's really interesting to work with all kinds of different collaborators from science or from other fields. But then, if possible, I've found interesting to try to make this move back to being understandable, back to being something that can be easily shared or easily reproduced at home. And I think that that's like I like this litmus test of, well, can you do this at home? Because then it's something that you can really engage with people and tell them about, and it doesn't just become a specialized a display of specialization or a display of high technology or expensive materials or something. Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure how this will translate into your practices, the people who are listening to this webinar, but that's just been a journey, I guess, that I've been on. And it'd be interesting to hear if anyone has some thoughts or some questions about these projects or about the things we've been talking about. Yeah.
Thanks, Asad. I guess I could sort of start us off and then see if other people have questions. Something that strikes me is these two words that we're using quite a lot at the place at the moment: knowledge exchange, and how you speak about. This isn't a question. This is kind of more an observation, perhaps, about your work to make transparent processes, which perhaps in other times, other places, we may have had different access to. And how that connects to the design of your work and the centering in my understanding of sensory and embodied experience as the site of that understanding, and how that then connects. It's like a little loop back to access and accessibility when you talk about the children and their sense of wonder or joy being a slipstream towards perhaps knowledge and education in a way that is not always perhaps prioritized by school and schooling. And so, yeah, I get really interested in that relationship between learning and teaching and excitement and the body, which I guess, not all of us in this chat are going to be people who are working with dance, but we're all in some way engaged with arts and the body and an embodied experience. So I think that's really, really interesting. And yeah, maybe I mean, I have a question, but I wonder if that's like a little funnel that might invite anybody else to ask anything that's come up for you. You can either you can put your video on, you can raise your hand, you can type into the chat, let us know any questions, I'm scanning those who've got the video on. Yes, Billy Maxwell Taylor, go ahead, Billy.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk, Asad. Really appreciate it. And yeah, it's really inspiring. And I've got like many questions, but I'll try and give space for others. I'll have my more practical question first. I'm really curious in this collaboration with, let's say, like, I don't want to say non-art forms, but like with sciences or with ecologists. And something I constantly sort of stop myself from doing that is when the idea of the first conversation, when you know nothing. And I was curious how you go about approaching, or what these sort of conversations might look like. And like, do you go with them with a proposition? And when you really do know absolutely nothing about like soil or hydroponics or whatever, yeah, how do you go about those initial conversations?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because that's one of the practical matters that really makes these kind of projects possible or not possible, is finding people who can help you, who know a lot about these things. And you know, interestingly, that connects to something when I was functioning primarily as a producer for Tino Segal, who's a German artist that Neve also knows very well. One of the things we used to do, which I did a lot in London in 2011, is recruit people to be part of these large-scale participatory works. And in order to do that, you would have to meet somebody and try to explain to them what you thought was interesting about the project. And in that case, it was a project that didn't even exist, that, you know, Tino had like an idea about, and that I would then try to explain what I thought was really rich and interesting about it to people. And for instance, someone like Neve, I remember very well explaining this project to, trying to explain why I thought it could be interesting to be involved. And in a way, that doing that task a lot helped prepare me to be able to talk to scientists about things that I knew nothing about. But what I would try to explain to them, which tends to work well, is I've found that most scientists are very passionate about what they do, and they're very interested in the idea of the larger public and the general public coming to know more and care more about their topic. So, you know, Alex McBratney was like, well, you seem like you don't know anything about this, but if you're interested in this and you have the ability to talk to a different audience, to me, then that's interesting to me. And so I found that to be the case in general. Like more recently, I've been working on a project relating to light, and specifically different forms of radiation that pass through us all the time. And as part of that, I started talking with this physicist who studies the cosmic microwave background, which is like these particles that are still flying through the air from the Big Bang, even now, that are like on your if you have static on a TV, like part of that is from the cosmic microwave background. Again, I knew nothing about the cosmic microwave background, but now I know a little bit, and it's fascinating. And I found that people tend to be pretty interested for people to, because everybody is working in these fields, and normally these fields are quite siloed and pretty different, you know, it's very rare for people to even be able to talk across their field of physics. You know, they can talk to people who study the cosmic microwave background, but they don't even talk to the people who study, let's say, you know, galactic clusters or whatever. So if you're then saying that the strength of the arts is like you're talking about anyone who comes in the door, and you can bring some of their thinking, bring some of their subject to a wider public, you know, to thousands or hundreds of thousands, or in some cases even millions of people. I think that's quite interesting to a lot of people, scientists included. And if you are, you know, contacting a scientist who's not at all interested in that, then you kind of probably just have to move on to a different one.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Other questions, curiosities? Yes, we've got one coming in the chat. So Meiting Fang asks, following Billy's question, may I ask how you manage the rehearsal and budget and apply for large space? So that's a kind of production related question from Meiting Fang. Yeah.
I mean, the answer is not very cool. I don't think the answer is particularly interesting or fun, but like basically I don't apply for spaces. I get offered spaces to do, and sometimes they're very small. Or in the case of the show at my apartment, you know, no one offered it to me. I just used it because it was the only space I had access to. But somehow one curator who came to that asked me to be part of a different project. And so I don't apply for spaces. I've actually never done any. It's interesting because I've never applied and gotten anything. I've applied for things and not gotten them. But basically the way I get projects and then whatever budget comes along is from people who saw a work I did or a project I did and then asked me to do something. And also interestingly, even though I did some, in my opinion, exceptional and rich projects as a producer, I've never been invited by any of the curators I worked with when I was a producer to make a project. It's only people who've seen the stuff I did under my own name, who liked that stuff, whatever it was, who came to me with an invitation. Back when I was working, especially with Tino, we worked with like the world's most famous curators, but I've never had an invitation from one of them to make a show. So it's a lot about doing whatever you have access to, that's what you have. And that goes for a rehearsal budget. And, like probably doing that show in my apartment cost me a fair amount of money. Like there was no budget, there was no support, there was no nothing. But then because it had a good impact and people liked it, it got invitations to do other things came along. And in addition, people even liked it enough that like I was able to raise some money to make a book about that. And then I learned a little bit about raising money. And essentially sometimes now when I get a project and there isn't that much of a budget, I then try and talk to other people about finding ways to support it. And sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So, my best advice is really to just take whatever opportunity or non-opportunity you have, do it and try to do something interesting that you think is really worthwhile. And then, it typically leads to another thing. And in my case, for some reason, one other thing, like it's like each thing, like one person comes along and is like, oh, I liked this a lot. Like, let me invite you to do one thing. So I'll be like, okay. And just keep going. It never seems to be like 5 people come. It's just like one, each thing leads to one more.
That's my experience as well. And it's I know we're all coming into this webinar from different positionalities or points of view or parts of our journey. I think it's always super interesting to hear how artists find their way. I'm aware there was a question that there was a hand that popped up just before the other question. Does that person want to ask their question now? I'm just sort of scanning through for hands. If not, I have a question.
No, there is somebody who just came onto the screen, Lesul.
Yeah, Lysul, I might be
Yeah,
saying it wrong.
thank you. Thank you, Neve. Hi, Asad. Thank you for sharing your practice. I think the people before me also asked like about the production aspect because all of your installs require a lot of like heavy production logistics. And I have been drawn like when I saw your work at Portuguese, like I didn't see it in person, but like when you diverted that water body through the gallery. And all the other work, even with the soil and even the tennis work that you didn't mention in your presentation, but I see a lot of poetics in them, regardless of the association with science. And I was wondering, like, do you like? I think I read it as your practice as a bridge between poetics and making scientific activities poetic. How do you view that? Like, do you approach it? Do you see the poetics first and then see ways of executing it scientifically? I hope I'm structuring my question right.
I love your question. And also I take your question as a huge compliment that you see poetics in my work. I think that's wonderful. I'm happy that you say that. And the short answer, yeah, I typically come up with the idea of what I want to do, and that is more on, I guess, what you would say the poetic side, without knowing anything about how you might do it. Like the curators asked me, like, well, how would you divert the river through, Porticus without destroying it or flooding or whatever? And I was like, I don't know yet, but like, that's the idea. And they said, well, okay, let's talk about it. Luckily, they were wonderful young curators with a lot of energy and a lot of fearlessness. And so we were able to do that. But yeah, I typically start with the idea of the thing, not knowing at all how you're going to do it, and then find a way to do it. And to me, the thing about science, I never thought I'm someone who is interested particularly in science, but I'm not interested in science. And science is part of everything, you know, like also science and engineering are part of how, you know, anything that works, it needs to have engineering or science if it's on any kind of a scale. And so to make things that are going to work, like, and I think that's crucial that these things actually happen and they work. Then you need to work with the people who know how to do that. And I've always thought that that's a fun thing anyway. But there's another side of it, which is more, I don't celebrate the like newly enabled potential of a particular technology in my work. I tend to try to let you experience the, as you say, poetic, which I'm very happy that you say, aspect of it without thinking about, well, how is this work? You know, and I think there are some artists where it's more about that, like, well, this is magical, and how did that magic happen is like this, you know. I'm not, I think that happens already in our culture a lot, the celebration of novel technological possibility. And I think that's not necessarily what I think is needed more of.
Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for your question. Seriously. It reminds me, because some of my favorite artists I also find very poetic. And I think that to have someone find poetics in what I do, that's great. Okay, there's one in the chat. Should I just read this and then try to speak to it?
Yeah, and actually it really connects to what I wanted to ask you. Maybe I'll read it and then you can have a moment to reflect. This is a question that comes from Soph. So the question is, could you speak more on inviting in bodies as part of your exhibiting practices, whether this is the collective public body or even how it differs inviting soiled bodies, or maybe it's bodies of soil, or water bodies or bodies of water as part of exhibits, even the afterlife of these bodies and their involvement once an exhibit closes. I'm curious about your thoughts on how we can better include these sorts of bodies within the curatorial canon, for want of a better word, and exhibition making. So this is a really big question, which is amazing. And I'm going to add just another part of it, which is around maybe a little tough. The conceptualization of the performer, because I think that also somehow speaks to this question, knowing that we have just a few minutes. And so it might be that it's not possible to answer all of this right now, and we might signpost for some other ways you can see Asad's work. So Asad, a couple of minutes to have a go at answering that question.
I got 3 minutes, and then you have to wrap up, right? So, I mean, I love this question. I'm not 100% sure I fully understand it, but I think the thing that I don't know exactly what is meant by is bodies, because there's the collective body, the water, the body of water, the body of soil. I mean, one thing on a very practical note is I'm very interested in what happens to the soil, for instance, after the whatever is not given away to visitors. Visitors take a lot, but they can't usually take all of what we create. So, for instance, in Glasgow, one of my favorite outcomes is that the extra, what was not taken by visitors, we were able to find a wetland reclamation project that needed material to help to create this wetland again that had been an industrial area. So we were able to use the leftover neosoil for that, which I really love, because then it's like literally making part of a new landscape or waterscape. The body of water, the Main River, which we diverted, then flowed back into the river. And so I think in that case, that was very important to me. At one point, the curators brought up the possibility that, it would be a lot easier if we just pumped in some of the river water and kept it there, maybe moving it around. And then at the end, we put it back in the river. But that didn't feel like the real project to me. For me, it felt pretty clear that it has to be a constant flow from the river and through and then back to the river. And then at the end, you write, I'm curious your thoughts on how we can better include these sorts of bodies more within the curatorial canon, for want of a better word, in exhibition making. Now, I'm not 100% sure what it means here either, the curatorial canon, but if you mean like, how can my soil or my river diversion become part of the curatorial canon? I'm not sure. You know, these works are not owned by anybody. They do not get sold. They're not in museum collection. They're things that I was able to do with working with other people, and so far that's where it stays. So in the case of absorption, I'm kind of happy that like we were able to do it a number of different times already. Most recently, a year ago, in my show in Museon in Bolzano. And in the case of diversion, there is another one coming up, which I don't think I can really talk about yet, but that's in a very interesting location, in my opinion, diverting a river that has some history to it as well. So, but in terms of entering the curatorial canon in a way of just being known and people understanding these projects happened, that has occurred a little bit, I think. But in terms of being in a collection, that's something I have not succeeded to do, or I've not been asked to do so far.
Well done, Asad. I think you touched each point. It's as always, I think we need a little more time. So on that note, I was wondering if people have more questions for you, they'd like to know more about your work. I know we've got your Instagram account, which I can pop in the chat. Is there anywhere else that anyone should have a look? They just search you and find lots of things online, I know. Anything particular?
If someone wants to ask me, they can always email me, Neve. If you want to share my email with people, you can do that.
Great.
No issue with that. I may not get back to you the same day, but I will get back to you.
Perfect, great. Okay, well then I will do that in just a moment. It just leaves to say thank you so much, Asad. It's been a really fascinating insight into a practice which is in some ways familiar to me, but perhaps not so familiar to everyone in this chat. We don't know. I'll pop your email in there, and we're back next week for anyone who's free on the 29th of May. We've got a session with Bakani Pickup on writing care manifestos for your practice. So again, picking up on some of the themes from today going forward. And then on the 5th of June, you've got me imagining every body in the audience as a kind of partner. And then our last in the series, on the 12th of June, we've got another webinar from Temi Ajos, Grace Nicol, Katie Coe, and Thomas Goodwin, and they'll be talking about holding dance and caring for our ecology. So sort of a stepping stone of themes running through. Thank you all so much for being here, for your attention. We'll pop this on the website. You'll take a little moment, but then it will all be available there. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. See you next time.